They say some stories are too disturbing to ever leave the shadows. Hidden behind the mountains of America lie forgotten tales that were never meant to be spoken out loud. One of those stories begins not with a king or a queen, but with a girl. A girl who never even had the chance to grow into childhood before being given away as a bride. Her name has been swallowed by time and silence, but her tragedy lives on in whispers of the most inbred families ever recorded. Imagine a world where a daughter was not a child, but a bargaining tool, where purity was measured by bloodlines, and where innocence was stolen long before she understood what life was. This is not a fairy tale. This is a chapter ripped from the dark underside of American history. She was married before she reached puberty, locked into a life she never chose, and thrown into a cycle that created one of the most infamous bloodlines in the nation. Her story is not just about her. It is about generations of children trapped in a loop of secrecy, shame, and silence. Behind barn doors and hidden cabins, families created rules of their own, where love was not chosen and freedom was forbidden. When you look at this forgotten past, you do not just see one girl, you see an entire lineage cursed by choices made long before they were born. This is the hidden world you were never meant to see, and tonight we step into the shadows of the most inbred bride in America. The whispers begin in an isolated valley where mountains acted as walls and outsiders rarely came near. Generations lived there, cut off from the progress of towns and cities where poverty bound families tighter than blood ever could. It was here that children were born into families who already shared the same last names, and where marriage was often arranged not by love, but by necessity. For the young girl married before puberty, there was no escape from this cycle. Her body and her life were claimed before she ever had the chance to dream. The barns became prisons, and homes turned into cages, where entire generations repeated the same traditions and carried the same shame. By the time neighbors or travelers stumbled across them, the damage was already carved deep into their faces, their voices, and their very genes. It was not a family anymore. It was a closed loop where new children looked almost identical to their parents, and where strange habits marked them as different from the outside world. The girl at the center of this tragedy did not just become a wife. She became the unwilling mother of children who were destined to repeat the cycle she was forced into. Her life became the foundation of a bloodline that would one day become known across America not for wealth or greatness, but for isolation and inbreeding. And so the whispers of the most inbred bride in history carried on not as a name carved in stone, but as a legacy etched into an entire family tree. By the time the first children of this union were born, the signs were already visible. The faces bore unusual shapes, the eyes carried a distant look, and the behavior seemed out of place to anyone from the outside world. The isolation had created a mirror effect, where every new birth was simply a reflection of the last, and the cycle grew stronger with each generation. The young bride, now turned mother, was forced to watch as her children carried the weight of decisions she never had the power to refuse. The village around them remained silent. Neighbors avoided questions, strangers who passed through left quickly, and those who dared to look closer felt the chill of something unnatural. For the outside world, marriage before puberty was unthinkable. But in this hidden place, it was not only accepted, it was expected. A tradition born of desperation and sealed by secrecy. Generations blurred together, and soon no one could remember where one line of blood began and another ended. It was all the same blood, flowing in the same circle. The children who should have played in fields or gone to school instead grew up in shadows, mocked by whispers of deformity and haunted by the knowledge that they would never escape. As years turned into decades, the name of the family became a warning, a ghost story told in hushed voices whenever outsiders came near the valley. But for the girl who had once been a child, Bride, the story was not just a tale, it was her life, a chain she wore until her final days, with no chance of freedom. Her existence became proof of what happens when innocence is stolen, when choice is denied, and when isolation becomes the cruelest prison of all. Whispers began to escape the valley, stories carried by traveling merchants and wandering workers who passed through the region. They spoke of children who could not speak properly, of strange sounds echoing from the barns, and of women who looked twice their age before reaching adulthood. The tale of the child bride became the center of these rumors. She was described as fragile, with hollow eyes, and a silence that seemed louder than words. Her body still that of a girl, yet forced into the duties of a woman. Doctors and priests were rarely invited, but when they did arrive, they left unsettled. Some recorded in their notes strange deformities in the family, others simply refused to write at all, as if even mentioning the truth would curse their own lives. For the isolated family, secrecy was survival. They believed that if the outside world knew their reality, they would be torn apart. Yet by hiding it, they created a deeper curse, one that stained every new birth with visible reminders of the past. The girl who had once been married before she was even grown was now surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried the same burden. Each generation became both victim and proof of what had been done long ago. But the darkest part of the story was not just the physical signs of inbreeding. It was the silence that hung over the valley, an agreement by all to never speak the truth, even when suffering was right in front of them. Generations later, when researchers and journalists finally uncovered fragments of this hidden world, the story of the most inbred bride was no longer just a rumor. It was a haunting record of how far human desperation and secrecy can twist the meaning of family. Her name may have been lost, but her life remains a shadow, a warning etched into the forgotten corners of America's history. By the mid-20th century, the world beyond the valley was rapidly changing. But inside that sealed community, time seemed frozen. Traditions and secrecy outweighed progress. The descendants of the child bride still lived in crumbling homes and barns, their lives marked by the same eerie patterns seen for generations. Outsiders who ventured near were often frightened away by strange behaviors. The family members barked or growled instead of speaking. Others wandered barefoot through the woods, staring blankly as if lost between worlds. These were not legends, but real encounters whispered about in nearby towns. The authorities rarely intervened. Many claimed ignorance. Others quietly admitted that it was easier to turn away than confront what was happening behind those closed doors. Some neighbors offered food or clothing out of pity, but none dared to question the deeper truth. What had begun with one young girl forced into marriage before her body had even matured had now become a cycle that repeated endlessly, each generation feeding into the next. Each child born with the weight of choices they had no power to escape. The community's isolation was both a shield and a prison. It kept prying eyes away, but it also ensured that the suffering within never ended. The girl's story was no longer hers alone. It had become the DNA of everyone who came after her, a living reminder of what secrecy and desperation can do. By now, the silence had hardened into something almost sacred. Family members refused to speak to outsiders, avoided cameras, and resisted questions. The more the outside world pushed to uncover their story, the deeper they retreated into themselves. Yet the whispers would not die. Travelers wrote of what they saw. Researchers took notes. Journalists took photographs. The family that had once hidden in plain sight was now slowly being pulled into the public eye. But the true cost of their sigh lay Ants would remain buried with those who first made the choice. The girl who had been robbed of her childhood had unknowingly set in motion a history that no one could erase, a legacy written not in books but in bloodlines. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the family's story began leaking into modern media, shocking outsiders who could not believe such lives still existed in America. Documentaries revealed the haunting reality. Reporters described the eerie sounds of growling and barking, replacing human speech, and photographs captured faces shaped by generations of entangled bloodlines. The world reacted with fascination, horror, and disbelief. Some accused filmmakers of exploitation, while others argued the truth needed to be told to protect those still trapped within the cycle. But what the cameras could not show was the depth of trauma carried silently through every generation. Behind every blurred face was a lineage of suffering that had begun with a single child bride forced into adulthood before she could even understand what marriage meant. Her body was used as the foundation of a bloodline that would remain infamous for centuries. The family members rarely defended themselves. Some did not even have the ability to explain their reality. Their silence was interpreted in countless ways: pity, disgust, fascination, but rarely empathy. The world looked at them as a spectacle, forgetting that behind the unsettling images were human beings. Meanwhile, the forgotten valley that had once sheltered them was transformed by curiosity. Outsiders drove in to catch glimpses. Neighbors who had once stayed away now spoke openly about the family's strange history. Every new revelation fed the fire of public obsession, but for the descendants themselves, the exposure did little to change their lives. They remained in their same crumbling homes, wearing the weight of choices made long before they were born. When the camera crews left, and the stories faded from headlines, the family remained isolated, surrounded by the same walls of secrecy and shame. It is easy to treat them as legends or symbols, but harder to see them as victims of a cycle. They never chose a cycle rooted in one terrible decision. Generations ago, when a girl, not yet old enough to grow into womanhood, was forced to become a wife, that choice rippled outward, shaping lives long after she was gone, and ensuring that the scars of one moment in history would never truly heal. The story of America's most inbred bride is more than just a tale of one family. It is a mirror held up to society, exposing how silence, secrecy, and control can warp human lives across generations. What began with a forced marriage before puberty evolved into an entire bloodline, trapped in isolation, marked by shame, and watched by the world like a spectacle. The growls, the stares, the vacant expressions that outsiders found so shocking were not the family's true essence, but symptoms of an unbroken chain of decisions rooted in control and ignorance. Each generation became less free, less understood, and more removed from the world beyond their valley. In the end, the question is not why they lived this way, but why no one stopped it, why neighbors stayed silent, why institutions turned away, why a little girl was allowed to be turned into a bride before she had even learned what childhood meant. The tragedy of this story lies not just in the family's isolation, but in society's willingness to ignore them until it was too late. Today, the family's name is infamous, whispered across the internet, dissected in documentaries, and debated in forums. Yet very few pause to see them as people carrying the weight of choices they never made. Their faces become memes, their lives become myths, while their suffering remains painfully real. It is a reminder that history's darkest secrets are not always buried in ruins or ancient temples. Sometimes they live on in the forgotten corners of modern America, where silence allows cycles of trauma to survive untouched. The Whitaker family and the inbred bride who began it all will never be forgotten. Not because they were powerful or famous, but because they reveal a truth that society prefers to look away from, the truth that when innocence is stolen before it has the chance to bloom, it can ripple through centuries, leaving scars that no one can erase the tragic story of the child bride who became the matriarch of America's most inbred family is not just their history, it is a warning of what happens when humanity chooses secrecy over justice, silence over protection, and cruelty over compassion.